Okay, everyone. So it's 2 o'clock. So let's go ahead and get started for the day. So let's go ahead and start off with a couple announcements. We got to do a riddle for the day, and then we'll jump into our second worksheet of the year. So first of all, last Friday, hopefully you saw the announcement made by the university about when phase 3 classes can go back to face-to-face learning. And then hopefully then you saw my follow-up announcement on Canvas regarding that and what that means specifically for our class in this section. If you didn't, please go to Canvas and read that announcement. I think is really important that you do so. The short of it is this, that this section 002, or I'm sorry, 001, and section 230 is going to start meeting face-to-face next week. Okay, so we will meet in Stadium 1205. And for the remainder of the semester up till spring break, and then after spring break, the entire university goes to the virtual environment once again. And so we'll follow suit with that. So, but from here on out, hopefully we'll be able to meet in Stadium 1205. Okay, so that's the first announcement. The second announcement is that you have a problem set that's going to be due on Wednesday. So hopefully you've been looking at that or have looked at that. So if you haven't, please do so. You have to turn that in on Wednesday, and we also have a quiz that's going to be due this Wednesday. Okay. Okay. I believe that is it in regards to our announcements for the day. So let's kind of look at the riddle. I mean, I think that people have already started putting on the chat what this is, but let's read it. A doctor and a bus driver are both in love with the same woman, an attractive girl named Sarah. The bus driver has to go on a long bus trip that would last a week. Before he left, he gave Sarah 7 apples. Why did he do that? And people in the chat have got it, I think. Yeah, so an apple a day keeps the doctor away. So the apples are filled. It's very, very good, very, very original. So, so anyway, yes, that's right. So, okay. All right. So I did notice in the chat someone said my screen is paused. Is that true for everyone? Or are we okay with that? Come on, mic in and say, "Am I okay?" People can hear me.
I can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, we
Okay.
can hear you. Your video is just freezing a little bit, not your like presentation like the PDF, but just like your people face video, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. I know exactly what you're talking about. So what I'll probably do is just go ahead and turn that video off here in a little bit anyway. So as long as you can see my screen, so that's good. So let's see here. I can hear, okay, but not your camera. Okay, I'm just gonna turn off my camera because there are people having a problem with that. So, all right, so you can hear me, and then hopefully you can see my movements over here on this as well, okay? Okay, so today, let's go ahead and think about our worksheet. And we're going to jump back. So I'm going to move this to here because this is what we're going to be working on in activity 2. But we're going to jump back into really lecture 2 material for our worksheet today, which you're dealing with almost a week ago, or almost maybe even a week and a half ago. And if you remember in lecture 2, we were thinking about, well, first of all, how does glucose get into the body? Right? That was a very important topic that we dealt with, and quite an interesting mechanism that is undertook to do that. We're not going to really think too much about that in our worksheet today, but rather the other aspect of absorption of glucose, and specifically thinking about, well, what controls and what regulates how glucose can enter into different tissue types, right? Different tissue types have different physiological and metabolic needs for glucose. And because of that, then they have different means in which they will take glucose out of the bloodstream, okay? And we're gonna highlight some of those differences today in both of our activities. Now, there are 3 things that actually will regulate the absorption of glucose into a particular tissue. The first thing is the type of GLUT transporter that's found there, and specifically the kinetic properties of that transporter. That's one thing. The second thing is how much of the GLUT transporter is found in the membrane. That will be the second thing. And then our third thing is, well, what happens to glucose upon entry into the cell? Okay, and this would be the kinetics of the trapping reaction and also the isoform of hexokinase that's found within that particular tissue. Now, those last two things, the trapping reaction and how much glucose or GLUT is present in the membrane, we'll deal with in our second activity. In our first activity, we'll be looking at the kinetic properties of GLUT2 and GLUT3. So GLUT2 is but just a reminder, just to make sure everyone mutes themselves, so and that way we don't catch your background. So but anyway, GLUT2 is a transporter that's found in the pancreatic beta cell. It's also found in the liver. Okay, it has a Km of 17 millimolar. Okay, GLUT3 is found in the neurons, and it has a Km KT value of like 1 millimolar. Okay, now Km, just to remind you, so this is the Michaelis-Menten equation, which you'll need, okay, for today. But the Km is essentially the substrate concentration required to reach 50% Vmax. So if we take S and make it equal to Km in this equation, then we will find out that our velocity will be 50% of the Vmax at the substrate concentration that's equal to Km. Okay. All right, so that's what that means. And GLUT2 has 17 millimolar and GLUT3 has a 1 millimolar Km KT value. Okay, Km and KT mean the same thing. Okay, all right, now, so here's what you're going to be doing today in activity one. You're essentially going to fill out this table. I want you to calculate the percent of Vmax at 4 millimolar glucose concentration, and then again at a percent of Emax at 8 millimolar, right? Now, you might think to yourself, well, why 4 millimolar? Why 8 millimolar? Okay, well, 4 millimolar would represent really the low end of glucose concentrations in the blood, what would be considered in a fasted state, okay? 8 millimolar, on the other hand, would be the concentration at the higher end of glucose concentrations in the bloodstream, what will be considered the fed state. Okay, so I want us to look at the percent Vmax at both of those for GLUT2 and GLUT3, and then look at how you get a percent increase going from 4 millimolar, a fasted state, to an 8 millimolar. What is our percent increase in the activity of GLUT2 and the activity of GLUT3? So our percent increase, this is how we calculate that. Okay, just take essentially the percent Vmax at 8 millimolar minus the percent Vmax at 4 millimolar and divided by the Vmax at 4 millimolar multiplied by 100. Okay, now all the math is fine. Okay, and the math is actually really helpful. Okay, but the main point of this is to use the math to illustrate, I think, a really powerful principle here, and that is how the different GLUT transporters are used by tissues with different physiological and metabolic needs for glucose. In fact, the last question says, having done the above, filling out that table, now give a possible explanation for why GLUT3 is found primarily in neurons and GLUT2 is found primarily in the pancreatic beta cells and the hepatocytes for the liver. Okay, so that's really the main point, is why are these used. Okay, all right, so here's what we'll do. I'm going to go ahead and set up your breakout rooms. I want to give you 10 minutes to do this. Okay, so go ahead and do the calculations and then try and answer that last question here. Okay, let me change our time here, 10 minutes. There we go. Okay, I'm going to open up the rooms right now. Okay, and Owen and I will be walking around in them. There might be a log jam, so the rooms are open. There might be a log jam getting into some of them. Okay, when I see that, I'll start to put people in rooms. But go ahead and add yourself to the room right now. Okay. All right. See you in 10 minutes. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start adding people to rooms as I see it kind of slowing down, people getting in. So if you're not in a room, don't sweat it. I'll try and get you in one, okay? Okay, I think I got everyone in a room. Hey, Owen, how you doing?
I'm all right. I just got done with my first biochem of disease test last hour.
Oh, okay. How did it go?
I think it went well. It was a lot of critical thinking, but the material itself wasn't too hard. So
Good. Yeah, it's kind of an interesting class, right? You enjoy it?
yeah, definitely. I like the way it's kind of bringing in topics from the last few years all together.
Yeah, that's really nice, right? Good way to kind of finish things out for biochemistry. Have that kind of class that applies a lot of those things.
Yeah.
So, if you notice things are not going well with my video or whatever, just go ahead and let me know. I never know what people are seeing. So, Alec, did you need me to put you in a room? Oh, he's already in there. Okay, great. So yeah, so just kind of mic in and just say, or something like that. Hopefully it's all right. People were saying that my video is not great. Is my video bad for you?
It seems fine for me now, but if I see it, I'll let you know.
Okay, great. The biggest thing is audio and then what I'm writing down. That would be the, if they can't see that, that would be bad. So,
yeah.
So, okay. Well, maybe give them a minute or more so, and then we'll kind of jump in there. Try and give them some time to get their feet under them on this one. This is kind of a more challenging one in some ways, but I think the point is really good about it. So, okay, I'm gonna go ahead and start jumping in here. I'll start at room 1. Sound good?
Sounds good. I'll go from the bottom.
Okay, great.
Hello.
Hello. Any questions in this room?
I think I just don't really understand how to do this calculation.
Okay.
So if Vmax is equal to 1/2 km, right, then it would be 8.5 over 21 for the 4 millimolar Vmax in GLUT2, which gives me 0.40476. And I feel like that's a really weird number.
I would agree. That's a weird number. So let me help you out a little bit. This can actually be a really simple calculation. And I think it did a little bit different in the class, and that might be, kind of what's confusing you. Okay. And so the way to do this would be to essentially substitute what you have for your substrate concentration 4 into the Michaelis-Menten equation. So it'd be Vmax times 4 divided by, and then just put your Km in, 17 plus 4. Okay, so then it's just 4 divided by 21. And then multiply that by 100, and that's your percentage of the Vmax that you're at that 4 millimolar concentration. That make sense?
No, I'm sorry. I'm still a little bit confused. So if I multiply Vmax times 4, and then I do 4 divided by 21, I don't understand how that gives me Vmax when I don't know what V0 is.
Well, so your V0 is going to be expressed as a percentage of Vmax. So you don't have to solve for Vmax. You're just trying to find a percentage of Vmax, right? So if you have, like I was saying, right, 4 divided by 21 is like 0.68, right?
Right.
Multiply that by 100, and my VO is 68% of the Vmax.
Okay, thank you.
Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, great. Any other questions in here?
Not from me, no.
Okay. Awesome. Okay, well, I'm going to go to another room. I had someone express they had a question, so I got to go to that room.
Right? The KT would be equal to 1/4 of the CS or of the S concentration, right? Math.
Wait,
good?
what did you?
So for GLUT3 for the percent Vmax for 4 millimoles, the KT would be equal to 1/4 times the substrate concentration, right?
Yeah. Or I think
Okay.
just 4 times the substrate concentration.
Well, no,
And
because
then
the
plus
KT is
the-
1 and the concentration is 4, right?
Yeah.
So it'd be 1/4. Because in like here, like in the slide example, the KT was 15 and the concentration was 5. So it was 3 times the substrate concentration. But here, the KT is 1 millimole and the concentration is 4, so it'd be a fourth, I think.
Oh, I see.
See what I mean?
I
All
see.
right. So then if we try to solve it the same way, then we have Vmax times the substrate
But then-
concentration.
And then you like add the other concentrations. So you have 1/4 concentration plus the other concentration.
Is then everything just cancels out because it's just a fraction.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it would be 0. So that
Hi.
Any questions in here?
We don't know what we're
You're stuck on like the very first part. So we have like the formula you gave us
Uh-huh.
at the beginning, but we're confused on where to plug everything in because we have the 4 millimolar for the substrate concentration and the Km, but what do we use for like the Vmax?
Well, so what you're going to do is solve for the velocity as an expression of the percent Vmax.
Oh,
And so what you have is 4 divided by 17 plus 4, which is
oh.
0.68. Multiply that by 100 and you get 68% Vmax. And that's your answer.
Okay, so we don't need an actual value for like plugging in the Vmax.
No, you don't. Nope.
Okay.
We're going to just assume that Vmax is going to be the same. So those are percent of the maximum velocity, whatever it is, right?
Okay, so then you're just saying like you calculate for like the Vmax of 4 millimolar is like just in that percent increase equation.
Yeah. So the percent increase would be then so you've solved the percent of Vmaxes.
And and then you plug them all in.
Yeah, and you're just looking at how much did I increase going from 4 millimolar to 8 millimolar as a percentage.
I see. That makes a lot more sense.
Okay. Thank
Okay.
you.
Excellent. Yeah, no problem.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, so I think that everyone's back in the main room now. So I was able to kind of jump around and get to a couple people's rooms and heard people struggling with this and, how do we do this and that kind of thing. So so let's go ahead and look at this. So I had done something like this in class. I think we did something like this. And it took one tactic, and certainly that tactic was okay to do it in class. There's another way to do this as well, okay? And so I want to just go ahead and first of all, just calculate these percent of Vmaxes at 4 millimolar and 8 millimolar and then the percent increase. And then we'll start to think about, well, what's the difference between GLUT2 and GLUT3 and the tissues that they're found in, okay? So let me once again turn off my video. And let's just do this real quickly, okay? So essentially what you were really being asked to do is find our VO as an expression of the percentage of Vmax at that particular substrate concentration, right? So we could just say this for GLUT2. We could just be very simple and just say, okay, well, I don't know what Vmax is. It's something, okay? But if I take that times 4 millimolar, right, that would be my substrate concentration. And I divide this by my Km, 17 millimolar for a GLUT2. And then I add 4 millimolar again. Okay, what I essentially have is Vmax that would like 4 Vmax divided by 21, okay, which is 0.68 Vmax. Multiply that by 100, and I would get this to be somewhere around, not 0.68, I'm sorry, I was thinking about a different problem. Okay, but 4 divided by 21 would not be 0.68, it would be 0.19, and that would be like 19% of Vmax, okay? I think I said 0.68 in one of my rooms, probably confused people. Sorry about that. So, okay. Right now, that's our percentage of Vmax for GLUT2 at 4 millimolar, 19% of the Vmax. So what that means is this, right? If Vmax was 100, let's just pick a number, right? And let's pick one that's easy. If Vmax, the actual, is 100, something units per second, right? That would be a rate, okay? Then we would be saying that this GLUT2 would be at 19, the velocity would be at 19, okay? Something per second or whatever, okay? Now, if you go on and do this then for 8 millimolar, of course, our equation would be Vmax times 8 millimolar over 17 millimolar plus 8 millimolar. Okay, and this would be 0.32 Vmax or 32% of the Vmax. Okay, and again, if our Vmax was expressed as, as a rate, then this we would be saying a rate. Let's say Vmax is 100, right? That's the total or the absolute maximum velocity of GLUT2. Well, this would be we're at 32 then. Okay. Right now, finally, we can go to this. We can do a percent increase, meaning this. Okay, we'll take 32%. Okay, the Vmax at 8 millimolar minus Vmax, the percent Vmax at 19 millimolar. I'm sorry, at 4 millimolar, which is 19%, divided by 19. Okay, times it by 100. And what we'd find out is that, and this is where I got the 68 from, okay, is that my percent increase would be 68% increase. Okay, now let's think a little bit about what that means. That means this, that GLUT2, the activity of it will increase 68% when the body goes from a fasted state to a fed state, meaning that those tissues that have GLUT2 embedded in them, the pancreatic beta cell and the liver cell, will have a 68% increase in the amount of glucose flowing into them when we go from a fasted state to a fed state. Okay, that's what that means, okay? Based off of these values here and the kinetic property of GLUT2 having this really, really large Km, not a very high affinity for its substrate, okay? So that's one way to look at this. Okay, now let's move on and compare that. We're really dealing with this in relative terms. Let's compare that then to GLUT3. Well, GLUT3, the only thing that would change in our equation here would be that we'd substitute 17 millimolar for 1 millimolar, which drastically changes our numbers. Okay, in that case, this would be equal to, at our low end, 80% of the Vmax, and on our high end, 88% of the Vmax. Okay. So at the fasted state, the 4 millimolar, the GLUT3 transporter is already sitting at about 80% of its velocity. Okay. Move up to the fed state, right? Glucose concentrations increase; they double actually in the bloodstream. Well, we only go from 80% Vmax to 88% Vmax, which constitutes, in this case, only a 10% increase. Okay. So the neuron would experience then a 10% increase in the in the amount of glucose coming into the cell when it goes from a fasted state to a fed state. Now, the biggest thing here to look at will be, of course, the difference between these percent increases. Okay, it's quite significant for GLUT2, but not nearly as significant for GLUT3. Okay, now let me just ask this, and you can type this in the chat, or someone, some brave soul can mic in and, state this, the answer to this question. But when you think about GLUT2, and you think about, in particular, let's think about the pancreatic beta cell. What does the pancreatic beta cell do in response to an elevated glucose concentration? What should it do? What does it need to do?
Shouldn't it filter it out?
Well, it can certainly be more along the lines of the liver, okay? But another, you were going to say something else? Or anyone want to take advantage of this? I mean, think about the pancreas. What does it do?
It would release insulin when the blood glucose levels are high.
Yeah, great, right. So that would be true. And I'm go back to even the idea of filtering it out. We were thinking about the liver and that kind of thing, right? So when we think about these cell types, okay, the pancreatic beta cell is the one I highlighted, okay, and Sarah's right here, okay. They are going to, in response to changing blood glucose concentrations, they're going to release this molecule insulin. Okay, now the liver is going to respond to insulin, and that's going to then create a lot of influx of glucose into those cells. Okay, but when we think about this, okay, these tissues that have this GLUT2 transporter in them, they are actually very sensitive detectors of blood glucose concentrations, okay? And the reason that they're very sensitive detectors of them is because of this percent increase, right? When we go from a fasted state to a fed state, they have a 70% increase in glucose influx into these cells, okay? And that's going to change the physiology of those cells. And those cells then are going to respond by doing something. And they respond by kind of a combined effort. They will respond by essentially maintaining or regulating glucose concentrations in the bloodstream, okay? In particular, the pancreatic beta cell will release this thing called insulin. And the reason it will do this, and we're going to get to the mechanisms of this later on in this semester, but when glucose comes into these cells, more flux will go through glycolysis and cellular respiration. There'll be greater ATP concentrations in the cell, and that will then allow these cells to produce and release insulin. Okay, and we'll talk about how that happens later on. Right? Now, compare that then to the neuron. Okay, when we look at the neuron here with GLUT3 embedded in it, okay, the neuron uses really almost exclusively glucose to meet its energy needs. And of course, the neuron has lots of energy needs. It's constantly maintaining these ion gradients across its membrane, and that takes a lot of ATP to do that, right? So it's very important for the neuron to be able to take glucose into itself really at any concentration of glucose found in the blood. Okay, so what we see here is that there's not that big of a change in the amount of glucose going into the neuron when we look at going from a fasted state to a fed state. Of course, we've all fasted, right? I mean, you go 4 hours past a meal, that would be considered a fasted state. And we know that our neurons just don't shut down at that point in time. And the reason is because they have this GLUT3 transporter that's still sucking in a lot of glucose out of the bloodstream, and that's able to maintain then appropriate ATP concentrations in those cells, okay? Blood glucose concentrations go up. Sure, there's an increase in glucose going into the cells, but it's not that much, right? From a percent increase standpoint, okay? Right, so the neuron is really kind of a selfish tissue, if you will, in that case. This is going to take glucose at all concentrations, okay? Now, of course, it can be dangerous when you get into a real hypoglycemic state, right? Then glucose can't get into these cells nearly as efficiently. And in that case, then that can lead to a coma, okay? Then that's why, blood glucose concentrations are very important to maintain, and that would be the responsibility of course, the pancreas, like we've talked about, the beta cell releasing insulin, okay, as well as the liver, okay? All right, so that's the main point of this, right? Again, the mathematics, right? I mean, you kind of maybe slug your way through that, but the mathematics kind of illustrate powerful take-home message about the difference between these two tissues and why they become equipped with these two different transporters. Okay, and that's really what I want you to take away from this is those differences. Okay, questions on this? Okay, let's do
So
this.
I actually do have
Yeah.
a question. So I
Yeah.
was just thinking of how to word it. So for the GLUT2, the entry of glucose into the cell would cause the release of insulin. Why?
Well, we have, so with the pancreatic beta cell, the question is why would it release insulin? So that insulin then can go out and be a signal that to the rest of the tissues that actually there's a lot of glucose. And then those tissues need to start to take glucose from the blood. In fact, that's really, we're going to lead to that in activity number 2. Okay, kind of the why there. Okay, we'll look at the mechanism of how insulin is released in response to that later on. We haven't gotten to that yet. But the why would be that insulin then is a signal from the pancreas that that there's lots of glucose, start doing something. Okay, and the pancreas had to be able to detect that there was lots of glucose, and GLUT2 allows it to do that. And then its response is to release insulin. Okay.
So like other cells would then take up glucose as if they don't normally, or just take
That's
up more glucose?
exactly right. So that question that you just asked leads us perfectly into activity number 2. So let's look at activity number 2, and I hopefully that will answer that question. Okay, so it's a perfect question. So let's do this. All right, let's look at activity number 2. All right, and look at, in this case, we're going to be looking at GLUT4. Okay, and GLUT2. Okay, so GLUT2 is one that we talked about in the pancreatic beta cell and the liver cell. GLUT4 is found in skeletal muscle and adipose tissue. Okay, so what I want you to do is, again, calculate our percent Vmax of 4 millimolar and 8 millimolar, and of course, the percent increase. But then there's this really important question, okay, and set of questions that I want you to look at, and that is, what else do we know about GLUT4? Okay, and so look at those questions. It says, let's pause here and think about this by answering a few questions. Look at those 4 questions at the end of this after you do this calculation. And then that will hopefully bring up some of these other aspects of glucose absorption in the cell. In particular, how much GLUT transporters are found in the membrane, and also the thing called the tracking reaction. Okay. All right, so let me go ahead, in the interest of time, start our breakout rooms. I'm going to give you let me give you 10 minutes. I'll give you 10 minutes, okay? And we'll hopefully be able to get through all of this when we come back, okay? So 10 minutes, go ahead and do these calculations, get into your room and start working on those, and then we'll all come back and look at this together as a class. Thomas, did you get into a room? You there? He must have got in. Hard to say. That he's like a ghost. It's like a Zoom ghost. You know what I mean? People that look like they're there, but they're really not. That could mean lots of different things in Zoom. Quite honestly, could be the person that logs on, turns off their video and walks away. That could be a Zoom ghost, or it could be what I think Thomas is, and that's just a software glitch, because I think he might be in a room. So. So I kind of jumped around on that one. I had I kept on getting like did you get those messages? Like room 12 has a question, room 13 has a question. Did you get those?
No, I stayed in 15 the whole time because they kept asking me to help them with the math, so I never got to move on.
Okay, that's okay. That's why we do this. So
Yeah.
I got these messages that pop up and say, hey, this room needs help and this room needs help. So with this many rooms, it's hard to cover all of them. So especially if they have questions. So okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and jump into a couple of these rooms and we'll move on from there. Okay.
Sounds good.
I'll go to room 3 first.
Keep going up from the bottom.
Oh,
Would it even change the amount of GLUT4 present? Because it just kind of goes from the center of the cell to the membrane.
I guess when it does have a lot of insulin present, it's going to absorb a lot of the glucose.
Let's see. 4 will be more active, and so it'll reach Vmax slower, right?
I mean, if it's more active, it would reach it faster, I would think.
So let me kind of jump in here, just kind of listening in, if you don't mind. You're headed in the right direction when you're talking about more glucose getting into the membrane, right? So what do you think that would do to Vmax? If you have more enzyme present, I mean, GLUT is a transporter, but it's like an enzyme. If you have more of it, well, your velocity,
Increase.
yeah, it's going to increase, right?
So it's an underestimate.
Underestimate, right? Your percent of Vmax, you're assuming, what we assume is that Vmax stays the same, but in reality it doesn't in this case because we're moving GLUT4 to the membrane.
So it would increase the amount of glucose absorbed by the muscle cells?
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
All right. So you're headed in the right direction. Now think about, okay, what does that mean? Think about how much muscle there is and how much adipose there is. And then they have this huge increase in the amount of glucose that they can absorb when insulin's present. Right? What does that tell us about their role in this?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Well, I was saying, when you think about, so you've got the idea of this percent increase would be an underestimate, right? But then you think about the amount of muscle that's present, and you think about the amount of adipose that's present. When you think about just your body mass, right? I mean, how much of your body mass is actually muscle cell? It's a lot of it, right? Compared to the liver, which is a pretty small organ relative to the muscle. And then these have these huge increases in glucose absorption upon insulin signaling. So what does that tell us about what they might possibly be doing in the body?
Wouldn't they be taking in more glucose to store it up for later?
Sort of for later, what will that do to the blood glucose concentration?
It'll bring it down.
Bring it down, right? Yeah. So insulin is a signal from the pancreas that there's plenty of glucose. In fact, we're headed into a hyperglycemic state. The body needs to respond by taking in glucose out of the bloodstream, right? And these tissues, in particular, skeletal muscle and adipose tissue, are one of the more important tissues that actually bring that back to a level where it's not hyperglycemic anymore.
Because they're absorbing the glucose?
Because they're absorbing the glucose. Yeah, because they have more, in response to insulin, they have all of a sudden this increase in the amount of GLUT transporter found in the membrane. So.
And it's taking like the glucose out of the bloodstream.
Yep.
So only tissues that have these GLUT4 transporters would be taking the glucose out of the bloodstream when insulin's present?
No,
or what? Like if we're going to a hypoglycemic state, wouldn't other tissues that maybe don't normally take glucose, would they also absorb glucose?
Yes, all of them are. So when glucose concentration goes up in the bloodstream, they're all going to start absorbing more glucose. Neurons too, right? So, but neurons aren't going to be affected as much by changes in glucose concentration in the blood. Okay.
Right.
Right. because their GLUT transporter is so efficient, right? So, and all tissues, the liver and everything, are going to increase their glucose absorption. Okay, what we're saying though in this case is there's an abnormal amount more absorbed at 8 millimolar into these cell types relative to 4 millimolar. Okay, because all of a sudden they come equipped with this GLUT transporter that goes to the membrane only when insulin's present. Right, so you have this huge jump in the amount of glucose that these cells specifically are absorbing relative to most cells, and they then play the biggest role in absorbing glucose to just bring it down into reasonable levels for the body out of a hyperglycemic state.
Okay. That makes sense.
Good.
And then when it's asking about the additional regulatory mechanism, is it just talking about the G6P sensitivity?
Exactly. So because those cells, because the worry there is that, well, there's so many cells, what's to prevent them from draining the glucose entirely from the cell, right? Or entirely from the blood. Well, that G6P feeds back and prevents the hexokinase reaction from trapping it, and that will slow down the glucose absorption by the cells. Awesome. Okay, well, I'm going to go in another room, but you're headed in the right direction. Nice job. We'll see you in the big room.
Yeah. Okay.
In the big room.
Okay, so you should all be back in the big room now, or close to everyone being back in the big room. So let's go ahead and jump into this. We don't have a ton of time left in the class, so I want to try and make the main points with this, right? So hopefully the math here, because we've already kind of done it, will be fairly straightforward, right? You should have gotten percent Vmax here for GLUT4 at 4 millimolar would have been 44%. Okay, somewhere around there of the Vmax. Okay, and again, that would, right, if our Vmax is 100, that's, you know, a velocity of 44. Okay, and then we have at 8 millimolar, 62%, and this would represent then, if we were to look at a percent increase, okay, of let's see, 40% increase. Okay, so it sits kind of between the pancreatic beta cell and the neuron, okay? But here's the thing, okay, that we really need to think about, right? And what we are assuming in this, I'm gonna put a little box around these, we are assuming that Vmax has remained the same when we went from a fasted state to a fed state, right? I've mentioned if Vmax is 100, then this is what it would mean. And I haven't even said or given the possibility that Vmax would change, but is that a good assumption? What do you guys think? Yes or no? Is that a good assumption to think that, in particular with GLUT4, Vmax won't change?
No.
No.
No, I don't think it is a good assumption either. And here's why. Vmax is equal to this thing called kcat, which we haven't really talked about too much in this class. It's the rate constant of the rate limiting step, multiplied, and here's the main point, times the concentration of the enzyme, or in our case, the transporter, right? So Vmax would be equal to kcat times the concentration of, in this case, GLUT4. Well, GLUT4 concentrations in the membrane change drastically when we go from a fasted state to a fed state, right? So if you come here, right, we did this a little bit in class. Okay, this would be an adipose cell, right? And what we were looking at here in green, this would be essentially GLUT4 tagged with GFP, which will fluoresce green. Okay, and what we have on our left, this would be an adipose cell without insulin. And what we see here is this, that the GLUT4 is really just kind of centered in the middle of the cell. However, when insulin is added to the cell culture, then it signals to these cells to move that GLUT4, to mobilize it and move it to the membrane. Okay, and so we get it, of course, centered right around the membrane of these cells. Okay, and the cell is just rimmed with this GLUT4. Okay, and that's what happens with insulin. Now, of course, the pancreatic beta cell, when we go from a fasted state to a fed state, we just thought about, okay, well, it's very sensitive to detecting glucose concentrations. It detects the glucose concentrations are going up. It has a 70% increase in glucose coming into its cell. It then releases insulin. That insulin then goes out and it signals to adipose tissue and to skeletal muscle to increase the amount of GLUT4 found in their membrane, so that this Vmax value, right, increases drastically, right? If you think about it this way, in the fed state, that Vmax, right, I think it's an underestimate, but we could say that the amount of GLUT4 found in the membrane has doubled, which means that, going back to our hypothetical scenario, if Vmax was 100 at 4 millimolar, in these cells with GLUT4, then the Vmax would be 200, right? Right. So in that case, then we have this doubling in Vmax. So it would be 62% of a doubled Vmax. So in total, we could say that this is actually could be, and this is again hypothetical, I think even this is an underestimate, but this could be 124% of the original Vmax, the 100. Okay, and that would mean that our percent increase would be actually 181% increase. Right, so this is actually, this here, percent increase is a massive underestimate of the percent increase of glucose coming into these cells. Okay, and here would be the really important point, right? It says, well, what does this mean, right? One of our questions is, what does this, our answer above, tell us about the possible role that muscle and adipose tissue play in maintaining steady state glucose concentrations? Well, they play a really important role in actually bringing glucose concentrations down in the bloodstream, okay? In fact, when we think about type 2 diabetes, one of the hallmark features of that disease is that an individual with that disease will have, after a fasted state, they'll have a fed state, they'll have a persistent hyperglycemic state, okay, meaning that they're not removing glucose from the bloodstream. The reason that we've discovered that is the case is because their muscle cells and their adipose tissues are insulin resistant. They don't recognize insulin any longer, right? And meaning that they don't move the GLUT4 to the membrane, and therefore the glucose concentrations in the blood remain high. So skeletal muscle and adipose tissue actually play a really important role in dropping glucose concentration in the fed state back to normal states, okay? Right now, the last thing, we are really cutting it close on time. Let me just real quickly draw it out this way, okay? Because the question is, well, we've got all this muscle cell and all this adipose tissue that's all of a sudden absorbing lots of glucose, right? Because GLUT4 has been put into the membrane. What slows it down? Because if nothing slows it down, those tissue types, then they'll just keep taking in glucose and they'll drain the glucose entirely out of the blood. And that will be bad for the neurons in particular, right? So we have this glucose flying in here. What's going to slow that down? Well, that glucose is going to get converted to glucose 6-phosphate by the trapping reaction. Okay? And the hexokinase isoforms that are found in these tissue types can be inhibited by their product, glucose 6-phosphate. And so if the trapping reaction is inhibited, that will actually slow these cells down from taking too much glucose out of the bloodstream. Okay? Right, so that will be this quote unquote additional regulatory mechanism in that last question. Okay? Right now, I am over time. Okay, I noticed that someone put something in the chat. So here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna hang out for people, that wanna ask questions in the chat. I will stay here until, people are gone. Okay, and before you start to leave, let me go ahead and do this. I will open up the poll everywhere question that we have normally done. So I'll activate this. Please ask any question, right? Look back at your last weeks of material and things that are confusing to you, things that you're not quite understanding. And hopefully we'll start to be able to do those things in the Q&A sessions, okay? All right, if you're pressed for time, please go ahead and leave. I understand that, I get it. And I will see you next week face-to-face in Stadium 1205, okay? If you have questions, hang out. I'm also going to have my Q&A session start here in a little bit. All right, great. Have a good week.
Could you maybe share the screen that you were sharing with the GLUT4 pulling in the glucose again?
Absolutely. Let me go ahead and do that. I know that was fast. I recorded this too, so I'll post the recording of this. So there you go. I also had in the chat, the question was, what is the trapping reaction? That's the hexokinase reaction. That hexokinase will catalyze the conversion of glucose to glucose 6-phosphate. It's the first step in glycolysis, but also called the trapping reaction, because this molecule, the glucose 6-phosphate, can't leave the cell. Okay.
So I'm still a little bit confused on how the G6P molecule inhibits the amount of glucose. So I understand that the glucose is being put into the GLUT4 and then converted using hexokinase into the G6P, but I don't get how that is the trapping reaction.
Okay, so it seemed like there's two questions. How does glucose 6-phosphate inhibit it, and why is that called the trapping reaction, right? So the first reason, so first of all, when we think about it from the standpoint of the trapping reaction, this glucose 6-phosphate can't go out through GLUT4, so that can't happen. So GLUT4 does not, its Km for glucose 6-phosphate will be so large that it can't actually bind to glucose 6-phosphate. Okay, it's not a substrate for it. So we call it a trapping reaction because there's no way for that glucose 6-phosphate to get out of the cell. Okay, unless it undergoes some phosphatase reaction, and not all of the cells are equipped with that phosphatase. Okay, now the next question that I think you had was, well, how is hexokinase inhibited by glucose 6-phosphate? And this would be an allosteric, or what would be called feedback inhibition. So it's an actual enzyme that will bind its own product, and it may be, and I have to go look at this, it might be just simply competitive inhibition, meaning that as glucose 6-phosphate starts to accumulate, it will just remain in the active site of the enzyme, and that will slow the enzyme down from trapping more glucose. And then the less glucose that's trapped, the less glucose that can come in. Okay, so this will slow everything down. Does that help out?
Yeah, it does. So it just sort of, because of that trapping reaction, it makes the concentration of glucose in the cell less.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, when you start to look at this, it's a great point that you're making, okay, and that you're coming to. when you look at glucose coming into the cell from GLUT4, right? We have to think about the gradient between the outside of the cell and the inside of the cell, okay? And that gradient is based on glucose concentrations on both sides. Well, if the glucose is being siphoned away to glucose 6-phosphate, then that lowers the effective glucose concentration in the cell, allowing more from the outside of the cell to come in. Well, if we stop that, then that gradient doesn't become as steep, and that will slow the amount of glucose coming into the cell, if that makes sense.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. Thank you so much.
Great, absolutely. And we're recording this, so it'll be helpful to everyone at some point. So, okay. Other questions, people?
I actually have can you just quickly clarify exactly what we're supposed to be doing for the problem set? Because I'm a little confused on the directions.
Absolutely, yeah. So what you've got in the problem set is essentially you've got to make glucose. I think that was the second part, and you got to not glucose, but you got to make glycogen and you got to break down glycogen. Okay. So I think in the first part, I can't remember which one is which, but I think in the first part, the instructions are tell you that you've got this glycogen granule that has 11 glucose molecules on it. What you need to show is the enzymatic actions taken to remove all 11 of those from the glycogen and make them into, I believe, glucose or glucose 6-phosphate. I can't remember what the directions tell you. Okay, but so you need to show all the enzymatic actions needed to do that. Okay. The other one is assume that you start with a core that has enough glucose on it. Okay, so you have a generated core, and then you need to show the enzymatic reactions needed to make a glycogen granule with 11 glucose molecules on it. Okay, and both of them are branched, so you have to think about branching and debranching enzymes as well in that. Does that clarify for you? Uh-oh. Did I lose you?
Sorry, did you want us to put them in order or actually draw them out?
Yes, you want to put them in order and draw them out. so yes. So in other words, right, you need to start with the glycogen granule, let's say with 11 of them, and then show, okay, what's the first step I need to start to remove glucose, right? And state that and show what enzyme that is, right? And then you just need to essentially remove all those glucose, right? And show how that's going to happen and draw that out. Now, it says in the instructions, if you think that one step can be repeated, then you can just say this step times 5 or whatever, right? So you can do that. You can take shortcuts in that, but you want to show it. Yeah.
Okay, but you don't want us to draw out the enzymes?
Well, you want to name the enzymes.
Right, you don't want us to draw the structures though, right?
No, there's no need for drawing structures out of this. So you can just, state, what the name of the product would be, and of course the name of the enzyme. So yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So I was able to get it anyone else?
Have a great day.
All right, you too. So I am gonna have to say goodbye to everyone because I have my Q&A session starting right now as well. Okay, so I'm gonna stop this. And if you have questions, go to that MS Teams link, okay, and you can bring those questions into the Q&A session, okay? All right, see you in a bit.